Welcome to this episode of the Insurance Brokers Podcast. On today's episode, we're delighted to be speaking to James Willison. James is the Managing Director of Web Connectivity Limited, or WCL. James's background is in management consultancy in the Lloyds and London market. Hello, James. Welcome to the Insurance Brokers Podcast. We've got a slightly different one today where we're talking to David of Boston Tullis and James of WCL. So welcome to the podcast.
Thanks, Sarah. Pleasure to be here.
So, James, just for the benefit of listeners, WCL has just been acquired by Xywave, and you guys do a lot of the back end sort of technical operational stuff in terms of trading platforms within Lloyds and things like that. I wonder if you could give us just an overview of how you came to be where you are.
So, yeah, brief plotted overview. We were founded back in 2003, going into 2004. I joined 2006 at a time when an American company made an initial investment in us. They were a data analytics platform called Willison over in the US. They increased their shareholding over time. So roll forward to 2011, and we were a sort of wholly owned subsidiary of Willison. And yeah, then into back end of 2020. Willison started having conversations with Xywave, looking at potential partnerships. Those conversations sort of progressed, obviously very favourably, and as the relationships developed and it moved more from perhaps a partnership to then Xywave looking to acquire Willison. We, being a wholly owned subsidiary of Willison, got sort of caught up, well, not caught up, but it became apparent there's a software business involved. And what's been really interesting is getting to know the Xywave team and the Xywave products and their kind of growth aspirations and how they're doing a business and how that kind of fits in, I think, very neatly to what we've been doing in the London market, but also overseas as well. And there's some initial kind of observation. Xywave has historically been very much in that kind of broker front office market. We as Web Connectivity, WCL, have been much more in the kind of carrier and perhaps back office and process efficiency type piece. So there's this sort of very neat story where you say, well, if you tie all of that front end, all that kind of placement, and then you're able to do process efficiency around that with the carriers, and that becomes really quite interesting.
I was talking to somebody recently about particularly London markets and the tech transformation going on there. Yeah. You're involved in that as well, aren't you?
So, I mean, it's really, so my background prior to working with you was sort of consultancy, management consultancy in the London market, looking at business process change, reform around placement, accounting, settlement, and claims. And we often used to think, what's the kind of the C-level, what's the C-suite which would require change in electronic placement, electronic accounting? Is it the CEO? Is it the CFO? It turns out no, it's COVID. That's the C-level change which is required, and that's what we've seen is an awful lot of the building blocks in place from a technology point of view in the London market. I mean, there have been trading platforms which have been available for a number of years. There's been some real successes in like electronic claims and having electronic claim files available. And then we've just seen this, the room, so the Lloyds underwriting room, shutting for the first time in its history. And bear in mind, we're talking 350 plus years, the first time for us to shut. Think about all the things which have happened in the past. It just puts into context how severe, how serious the sort of pandemic situation is. So for that to shut, so suddenly overnight, all of those face-to-face meetings, all of that placement activity, which would typically happen in the room, and people are putting wet stamps down on physical pieces of paper, that had to go. There had to be a way of sort of doing that. And luckily, there were these trading platforms in place, and we're just seeing the volumes kind of escalate rapidly. And fair credit to those placing platforms. I don't think they would ever anticipated such accelerated growth, but they've met the challenges of that, and business has continued. The London market, Lloyds, and the company market have carried on writing business. Claims have still been paid. Claims have still been processing. Whereas I think, had this happened 10, 15 years ago, there'd been a very different, very different kind of response to that.
Do you think that the changes that are starting to be embedded now, do you think they'll continue and the trajectory will continue? Or do you think the face-to-face relationship connectivity is so embedded in Lloyds that once the vaccination's rolled out, there'll be a decline back to the paper stamping?
It's a really interesting question, and it sort of comes up a lot, as you might imagine. I personally don't see that there'd be like a snapback. Like, it wouldn't be a case of, right, vaccine's there, everyone kind of then pile back into the city. I think there's been a lot of people have realised that it is possible to do a lot of these things remotely, and there are some advantages to doing that. And some of that probably linked to trust to a certain extent. I think there's a lot more trust now within organisations because so many people have had to do so much work from home, and actually productivity certainly hasn't dropped, and if anything, in certain, may have even kind of ticked up a little bit. Homeschooling aside, as we kind of discussed earlier, that adds an extra complication for those periods of time. But actually, I think people are putting in significantly.
Well, you mentioned having been acquired entirely over Zoom. We've onboarded, a big client entirely over Zoom. You've onboarded 3 employees entirely over Zoom. People are realizing that you can actually trust this technology. And in fact, we had somebody come into the office in between lockdowns who I've been working with since January 2020, but I've never actually met. And when she came into the office, we were talking, meeting, doing whatever we were doing. It was about 20 minutes in where we went, this is the first time we've actually met, isn't it? Nice to meet you. And it was so weird because you feel like you know people. But I think as in terms of general, that's correct. But I just get this, not being involved heavily in the Lloyds market myself, I get this feeling that the Lloyds market is so relationship based and, twisting arms and best buddies with and going for a pint with and all that kind of stuff.
And that is a key part of the market. And I don't think it's anyone's religion to sort of lose that. I mean, you still have all this kind of concentration of expertise that people are in regular dialogue. And so this concept of everyone coming into the office for Monday to Friday, 9 to 5, probably is happening. One of the things that Lloyds have done is opened up a kind of a virtual, so in the underwriting room, there's a virtual underwriting room. And that's a combination of, you could have it could be a face-to-face conversation going on, but you could then pull someone in kind of via Zoom or other way, and have the whole people kind of meet a mixture of face-to-face and Zoom. And that seems to be working really quite well. So, I don't foresee a situation where, we get to the end of hopefully the end of the pandemic and the vaccines are rolled out and people say, right, we don't need the room anymore, let's close the room. But I think its role will change and adapt, which, with such history involved in the Lloyds market, you'd expect that. You'd expect these things to kind of, move and adapt.
I wonder if I don't, like you, I agree, I don't think the room will disappear, but I wonder if some of the broking offices will disappear. So instead of commuting into your broking office 9 to 5, they may well have decided they don't need to be spending several million on a London office. You'll just commute in for your 3 or 4 Lloyds meetings and then go home again.
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot more flexibility around kind of working and offices obviously is the big question in terms of what's going to happen to the commercial spaces in London. We've changed our profile, sort of our footprint in the London market, where we've always had an office based in EC3. We've typically had a process where everyone comes in on Monday to Friday. Obviously, there's bits of flexibility here and there. We've actually reduced our office space with a view that there are certain roles now which they don't need to be in on a kind of regular basis, and that's perhaps accelerated some of that thinking that we're already starting to have, and that bit more flexible. What I one of the things that we've looked at doing is matching when people are coming into the office, but saying when you're going to be in. So, but I do think people are missing some of that face-to-face stuff, and where it becomes particularly, and it is possible to do those new deals and to build those kind of new trust and relationships, but it is better or easier perhaps to do it kind of face-to-face.
Just as a side note, David works the opposite way. He finds out when none of us are in the office and then he goes in.
So yeah, I think the technology piece and the dynamics will change the London market. Even before the pandemic, there was the Future at Lloyds work and the blueprint work. So relatively new CEO of Lloyds came in, had done the blueprint one. I think it was September 2019. I think when that was sort of published, and then recently sort of done another iteration of the blueprint. And it's a very far-reaching piece of work. I mean, there's some really, some of the there's lots of very interesting pieces in it. I mean, for example, Lloyds are starting to get their first sort of algorithmic-based underwriters. So there's a Key, which is a managing agent, is backed by Brit and Google. They are based on an algorithm that will kind of follow business which Brit has written, and doing that purely on a data kind of basis, which is that is revolutionary for the Lloyds market and what's been happening there. I mean, I was involved for my sins, sort of going back in time. So 2004, I think it was. So John Tyner, who was CEO of the FSA at the time, set his sights on the London and Lloyds market and said it was time to get rid of the deal now, detail later kind of culture. So the yes, we'll agree all that, and we'll agree all the terms at some point, some point never, but we'll get the deal done and we'll sort out those bits. And of course it was then, as per underlying wording, or it was as per last year, and you'd go back to the previous years and no one ever agreed what the original wording was. So there was a culture, and I was sort of involved in the market's response to that, to work out contractual certainty at the point of bind. So you knew exactly what the terms were for the contract, which in kind of hindsight, you think, well, surely that was something which you'd want to know. And it was a very positive response to that. And the FSA had said, look, if you don't sort this out yourself, we'll come in as the regulator and sort it out for you. And the London market were able to respond to that challenge and kind of met that challenge. Where I think we're now moving to is kind of the next iteration of that, the kind of financial certainty at point of bind. So you know what all the terms are, but now you know exactly what the premium split is going to be across all the different territories, what all the tax implications are, and some of these are very complex risks. So typically you know what the kind of the gross premium is, but the actual splits of how that is allocated across all the taxes may happen as a kind of after the placement process, before the accounting process really triggers off. You've got this kind of additional work happening, and that is all being brought up front. So you have this financial certainty at the point of bind, and that really enables you to say, right, we know what the contract is, we know what all the premium flows are going to be. We can now just move all of that data. So there's a lot about a sort of a common data record. What this is saying is there will be a common set of data, which is then shared between parties. And how you then choose to sort of do that, you could use a distributed ledger potentially, or you can, more sort of traditional, Lloyds, rather than a sort of technology mandate. They're saying, right, there's a common data set which is required for any class of, for a particular class of business, for how you then do the placement, for the accounting, for the claims. Which technology you use is then, we're sort of slightly more agnostic about, but you have to use that kind of common set, and that means you can then automate an awful lot of processes sort of behind that.
I've spoken to a few different people within the Lloyds market, and I get the impression that some of the changes going through, or some of the transformational aims, should I say, that Future of Lloyds are looking at, are a little bit controversial. Is that what you see as well? And if so, what elements are controversial? What are people
My personal view is they're not controversial. So if you look at what it is trying to achieve, is essentially saying, right, we want London to be, or Lloyds to be kind of more in line with the rest of the world. So if you are a kind of broker, it's easy to do business with the Lloyds market, and it's not more difficult to do business with Lloyds as it is with anywhere else. So that's looking at some of those historically being referred to as like removing Londonisms, but trying to make it sort of more aligned. But then it just talks about moving data around quicker, having better data sources, having easier reporting, moving and it's not just premium flow, sort of accounting information and a one-way flow. It's claims as well. It's improving claims payment, faster claims payment. So those type of things to me aren't controversial. Like you clear, to my mind, if you're going to reform something, you want the outcome to be that the end customer gets a better kind of service, and the reputation of the London and sort of Lloyds markets improved on the back of that. Obviously, how you then go about that can be sort of slightly more open to controversy. So I think that the aims aren't necessarily controversial. I think when you get into the detail, how some of those things are achieved, or to achieve some of the, there's some challenging goals set in there. To achieve some of those, actually, you've got to do things quite differently. It's not like sort of incremental changes to enable you to meet those targets. You've got to do some more fundamental change, and that's where people get slightly more perhaps apprehensive.
I spoke to Mike Keating, MGAA, this morning actually, and one of the things we were talking about was he's quite involved as a stakeholder in LMA DARE project, which I imagine ties into this, talking about delegated authority within Lloyds. And one of the outcomes of a survey they did with, I think it was about 160 brokers, was that the cost of Lloyds is prohibitive. So you're talking about aligning with the rest of the globe. What are your thoughts around that, and what sort of things are being done?
Yeah, so I haven't been as involved on the delegated authority side, although clearly it's a very important part of the Lloyds market in terms of the not just the volume but the value of transactions which come through on that basis. It is interesting. So there's you've got a sort of a regulator which is then saying, right, these are the fields you need to report on in terms of the delegated authorities, and then if you then went back and published those to the cover holders, the brokers, and said, right, this is all the data that we require, and that is different to what other markets or what other carriers require, suddenly you have a cost or additional cost doing things in the London market than you have kind of elsewhere, and that to me, it doesn't kind of sound right. You want it to be as kind of easy as possible. What I would like to think is that actually, when we're looking at delegated authorities, and you've got then within that you have your risk bordereaux, your premium bordereaux, your claims bordereaux. They're being reported to the London market. I think the vast majority of cases probably via spreadsheets. I think that's unfortunately the world in which we live in. But that data is being captured somewhere. Like it typically is in a system somewhere. I suspect it's being almost sort of exported into Excel, some additional pieces added to it, and then perhaps sent into the London market to sort of meet some of those nuances of London. I would like to think we can get to a stage where we can say, well, actually, give us the data at source, give us that raw data, and we, if that works for other markets, I'm sure they'll be able to work for us, and make it as easy as possible to send that data. And that's where we get into the, we talked about. Blockchain was the key thing that people talked about historically. I think now it's kind of shifted to kind of APIs is like the new buzzword which is going around, but which systems talking to other systems isn't something kind of new. I think it's just getting perhaps a little bit easier, or some of the technology makes that. But so I think that we've got to be now in a situation where technology can make these things easier. And I think one of the, going back to some of the previous conversation, we've talked about the pandemic and COVID, and I think people have been pleasantly surprised in terms of how technology has, how it's worked. I mean, it would be nice if everyone was on the same kind of platform. It's not that long ago when I went into our clients in the London market and saw their sort of video conferencing room, and it was, it must have cost thousands to set up with TV mics. Or this allows us to have a meeting with our other office in Bermuda, and we can kind of sit in like the same kind of room. And I was like, wow, that's really kind of clever.
Again, as an IT layman, as you said, there's a lot of different systems and products have been built and platforms have been built over recent. What there doesn't seem to be, and I don't know if the technology would now enable it, is a sort of completely joined up end to end. I mean, we don't in the insurance industry in the way other industries have. We haven't disintermediated anywhere. It still goes from capital to reinsurance company to insurance company to MGA to broker to client, and at every one of those interfaces, there's still a load of friction.
Yeah, and I think there's. Clearly people have looked at it. I think in terms of the friction piece, one of the key areas has been around sort of data standards. So there might be multiple people which are, and for legitimate reasons, for your kind of insurance broker in a large commercial piece, and then you're obviously the reinsurance broker and the sort of the different skills there. But trying to have that, again, it comes back to that kind of common data record and consistent data. So people are capturing data once and not rekeying it. I think that in itself, if you really want to look at friction in the London market or any market, as soon as you start rekeying data, you invariably then introduce errors into that data. I mean, it's a fact of life, and actually those errors because there are so many touch points, errors get exacerbated through the process. So I think we have clients who are insurers, clients who are reinsurers, clients who are brokers. I don't see that there's any particular technology going right. We're going to put in a sort of disintermediation play, because that's a dangerous place perhaps to kind of be. But I think taking out friction is clear. And of course, if you look at at a conceptual level, when you look at sort of reinsurance policies and proportional treaty pieces, of course they are bundling things up to say, well, we'll take a percentage of each one, and so there's some products out there which are kind of inherent in that kind of it. Going to the capital markets, I know I don't know quite where they are now, but certainly people in the past have looked at sort of alternative insurance measures. So if you've got a crop exposure, do you take out crop insurance, or do you take out in a sort of a futures position in the price? So assuming there is the weather wipes out a huge percentage of the crops, then the price varies. So you can, but of course people have been burnt, I think, doing that, because where the weather occurs may not necessarily be where the impact on the price, and getting that correlation can be quite.
James, that's really interesting. Can you talk to me a little bit about trading platforms? I'm thinking PPL, and can you talk to me about the different platforms and how that works, please?
So when we talked earlier about those various kind of placing platforms and how they've responded to, and the volumes have gone up. So the one of those is the Placing Platform Limited, so PPL. So that is, and it's probably the one that the market is, the one that the most volumes are going through. But I think there's I don't know the exact number. Certainly at one point there was like 17 trading platforms in the London market which have been kind of approved for usage. So that they're not the only one, but they're probably the one that has got the most usage out of. And where we kind of sit in, because from an underwriting point of view, roll back in time, and their workflow was brokers queuing up at the box. They'd be sat at their desk, and there'd be a queue of brokers, and that would be their workflow. They would see, kind of in series, and that could be some new business, it could be some renewals, it could be some endorsements, but that's and of course that's not necessarily the most efficient use of sort of time. You move to electronic trading, and you're right, it's much more efficient because you can see all your electronic placements. They're kind of here. You can then search on those. You can triage. You've got data about them. You can do other things. But of course, what we've seen is is there's not just one trading platform, there's multiple trading platforms. So now from an underwriter's point of view, they, in a paper world, had something which wasn't that efficient, but it kind of worked. They had this kind of queue of brokers, and now they've got these multiple platforms to kind of go into. They get notifications, email notifications coming through and other things. And we as web connectivity are, and probably not the most I don't know, the most professional way to describe it, but we do a lot of plumbing. We essentially allow data to move from system to system or between trading partner to trading partner. So we plug into these multiple trading platforms and then allow underwriters to essentially have a view of their placements in one place, so they can kind of see what's my dashboard, where are my placements, and what systems are they, where can I sort of start to access them from, and then tie that then into some of the other sort of post-placement activities that can happen. So do they then send that document off to, if they were where it is still document-based, do we get some data coming out of the back of that so we can process that data? Do we start doing some reporting on the back of that? And how do we tie it into the accounting and settlement piece? So the other kind of efficiency play is if underwriters then got multiple trading platforms to go to, okay, if they then agreeing business on those platforms, that business isn't being replicated back into their transactional, so their policy administration system, which is their single version of the truth. That's where they need to get it. That's where everything kind of hangs off. So we look at ways of saying, well, once you've agreed it on this platform here, how does that then trigger a workflow to download all the data, make sure that is then populated into your internal system, so the underwriter's not having to key it into two places.
I can see sort of at first sight that there's iWaver at the front end and you're at the back end. But if you delve a bit deeper, it does sound like you're quite into the operational processes, where my perception of iWaver is that they essentially provide a marketing assistant.
Yeah, so a lot of that's around the distribution and marketing side. And we would, we typically are speaking to, the CFO, the COO, and we're talking to them about, well, once you've got all this data, what business processes do you want to change? Obviously, you've got software products kind of behind that, business process to then improve efficiency around that. What's really interesting to me is the broker customers that are kind of opened up. Right. I mean, we work with some of the the largest global brokers, which is fine, but not at the volume of brokers that kind of Zywave have as customers. Right. But that said, their biggest growth area, a big growth area for Zywave has been in that carrier marketplace, and that's where we are working with the majority of Lloyds managing agents. Lloyds are a customer in their own right in a number of ways. With a lot of the insurers and reinsurers across Europe. We're a London-based company, but we're operating 11 different countries, or the software is being used in 11 different countries. So that gives Zywave some of that foothold into the geographical expansion piece as well.
Yeah.
I think that's incredibly helpful. I think that's fabulous. I think I'd like to thank you very much for your time on the podcast, and I think it's been really interesting for anybody listening. I've learned a lot.
It's been a real pleasure. Thank you.